to open this meeting by just spending a few minutes checking in with people about the disaster that's been going on, and how people are working with it, particularly in their work, their computer work. They're helping with people. And so I just want to open the floor and remind people, feel free to unmute at any time. And if people have any comments about dealing with the COVID crisis and how it's affected your work, your computer work.
I'm happy to start.
Go ahead, Martin.
So my work is very one-on-one, and pre-COVID had a big component of in-person work because I help people understand how to use their computers. And like a driving instructor, you kind of have to sit with the person in front of the computer. For decades, I've been set up to do that remotely as well. So for most of my, let's call it regular work, not urgent, amenable to remote help, I've been doing 100% remote work. My clients have been very cooperative about that. But I've had a couple of appointments so far, and I'm heading into another one probably in the next week, where the client is stuck unless someone comes over to their house and does something. Whether it's setting up a new computer, whether it's rebooting their gateway, that's tough to do. You can't do that over the phone. So what I just worked out with someone who's actually a medical doctor who's in the high-risk group because of his age and maybe other conditions. And in fact, I nudged him a little bit and he took the ball and ran with it. So what we're probably going to work out is with mask and gloves and alcohol wipes and all that, I'm going to probably go over his house and set up his new computer, and with his old computer also set up, install my log me in on both of those computers, and then head home. And then remotely, I'll look over the old computer, figure out what needs to be moved, put it on an external hard drive, have him move the hard drive to the new computer, remote into the new computer, and set it up. So sort of a hybrid approach, but sort of minimizing but not eliminating the in-person portion, because it can't happen without that. I mean, I could try to coach him about how to set the computer up, but that's just really inefficient. So that's my compromise. And I figure, hey, he's a medical doctor. He knows more about COVID than any of us. So, and he seems to feel this is amenable for his situation. So that feels reasonable to me, as absolutely necessary only. And I do a little porch pickup and porch drop off of equipment as well. So that's kind of how I'm dealing with it.
That sounds familiar. I have 400 and some odd computers in a LogMeIn Central account, and that's the basis of what I do. I have a large box of blue rubber gloves in my car because hardware is not amenable to remote access. And some people say, just come on in, have your mask. And I try to go in when there aren't other people if it's in an office, but just use a judgment. It's been busy keeping everything running.
By the way, I'm happy for any feedback if anybody feels that I'm, for example, or Arthur, are taking too high a risk, or if it's reasonable, in our approach. So I'm happy to discuss and open a suggestion.
I was curious, Martin, the task that you're doing for this medical doctor is you're going in and plugging in the CPU? Is that kind of level?
Basically, yes. I mean, he might be coachable over the phone, but it's not his bailiwick. But for example, here's perhaps another example. I have this 97-year-old client whose internet gateway is in the basement. And if he fell down those stairs, he'd never make it back up again. So in his case, I went in and basically unplugged the power cord, plugged it back in again, gave it 10 minutes to boot, checked his computer, and then left. So that was something, there was no way, yes, maybe one of his adult children could have come over and done that, but I didn't think of that until later. But yes, you're right. In terms of this doctor, it's a unpack, set up, and maybe sit through some of the, what's the user's name, what's the password, and then go home, with him presumably being so very socially distant.
So for what it's worth, I erred more on the side of caution than you are in that kind of situation, where I've had customers who have bought machines And my general policy is I won't go into people's houses except for emergencies where there's really no other alternative. And so actually I had a customer who was somewhat elderly and definitely like not a computer person at all, and walked her through getting her machine set up. We did great until it turned out that we'd had a misunderstanding, and I'd understood that she was right next to the router and she was going to plug into the cable. And it turned out that she needed wireless. And so she didn't have a wireless adapter in this machine, so we didn't order one. And so I went and made an emergency call and put in a wireless adapter. But if I had to do it over again, I would have done it right. We wouldn't have had this misunderstanding. And my own opinion is that unless somebody is, and the way I determine this is I actually try it. Like if we try to get the machine together and we get to some kind of impasse like that one, where a house call is just really the only good alternative. But I err on the side of saying no house call. You have to set up the computer, and it has led to the most ridiculous one was a wonderful customer who's very not comfortable with computers, whose printer stopped working. And so we spent this comical time determining that there was the USB cable had gotten disconnected when she plugged something else in. But I couldn't describe to her where the USB cable plugged into this printer, because when you went online and downloaded the 4 different manuals that are available for this printer, I think it was a brother, 4 different manuals, a user guide, a setup guide, a maintenance guide, 4 different manuals. Not a single one had a drawing of where the USB port was. And the only way that I was able to help her was finally, I found some guy's video who happened to have the same model, and I was able to have a video showing where this was, and she was able to plug it in and everything was fine. And so one of my concerns is this definitely runs up time, runs up people's bills. And I've looked on that as part of this situation. And so when I do make house calls, it's because the person really, like their computer has failed, like for our clinic, their computer has failed, we need to do a swap. And they're not able to put in the computer themselves. And even then, I err on the side of saying, do you have a neighbor who could bring in this computer for you? Somebody who's already in your biome? Always with the eye to, it all feels to me like baseball. You're trying to shoot for a good batting average. You're not going to be perfect, but the less exposure, the better. So my opinion is that this doctor should set up this computer himself, get it on the internet, and you'll walk him through any desk or whatever tugboat you use to get the remote access going, and see how you do. And if it ends being a mess, then okay, this is a mess. I'll need to come over. That would be my suggestion.
Would you knock off some time for the flailing, so to speak?
No. So I'm looking on the flailing as being the cost of doing business under COVID.
Okay, fair enough.
And it's part of the cost. There have been benefits to COVID financially to people, but I definitely look at the flailing as us all making a good faith effort to make things work. I think so. Yeah, that's my opinion. Jeff?
A couple of thoughts in reply to Martin. One thing is that all of my customers, their routers I'm set up for direct remote access into, and that's helped a lot. So not only the concept of remoting into machines, but I can remote right directly to their routers, and sometimes that is their baseline, because as long as their internet is up and running, and if it's not, it's, very often Comcast's job to get that happening, and the very next device in the chain would be the router. So sometimes, I can solve problems that way. But the second thing is, Matt put out there a very interesting question at the end of asking for response from us about, what we thought was responsible or not, to rate what he's doing. And the thing, I'm more in Adam's camp at this point in terms of, it likely being overcautious and trying to avoid entry and contact as much as possible. But the thing that's hardest for me, beyond, as Martin said, giving up a lot of my business was based on face-to-face, in terms of development, is this many months into it, still not having a good sense of, what is okay and what isn't okay, and feeling like you have to err on the side of caution because this many months in, we still don't know if what we're doing is enough, if it's sufficient, if the mask, if the gloves, or, I mean, you still get such, disparate opinions on, on how easy or hard it is to, basically to catch it. So I don't know, what you can do beside err on the side of extreme caution.
Jeff, I just wanted to ask you a technical question about the router.
Sure.
When you say going into the router directly, so the routers that we use usually are on a network, and the way we get access to the router is through a computer, and then going into a browser to the router. But what you're saying is these routers have static IPs, and you're able to, from your computer, go directly into the router?
Absolutely. In other words, if there's a problem with the router, you're not able to remote into the PC to get on the network to turn around and work on the router. Whereas I can basically open a secure HTTP session directly to the router and basically see the same interface through that address that I would if I was, remote controlling into the computer and then turning around and doing the, 192.168.1.1, base address of the, of the internal address of the router, but using a secure tunnel to the static address that the customer has. And sometimes that is the only way I'm going to get on that network until I've solved the problem. And then, you can get into the machines.
How fancy a router do you need to have that feature?
Well, I would tell you in my world, I deployed almost all Sonic Wall.
Okay.
And their routers are carrying, for the most part, a universal operating system. So whether it's a $200 or $300 cheap one up to a multi-$1,000, very expensive one, it's the same old, I mean, I'm not saying some of the bigger ones don't do more, but it's the same OS. So, and that's a feature on it, as any decent router is going to let you do, whether it's from Cisco or, any of the other major companies.
Thank you.
And that has been, for me, the jumping off point in some situations of being able to solve a problem. And once I get that done, then it opens up the rest of the network to me.
Mm-hmm. Jeff, do you have any specific concerns about what one should do and what one shouldn't do? Are there any particular ones that are heavily on your mind as far as being safe during this time?
I really don't. I mean, as I was alluding to, I find it very disturbing that I really don't have a better sense of things than I feel that I do. And that is what drives me to, do everything possible. And that includes getting the customer to do everything they possibly can and showing extreme patience with them. I mean, I have some customers who have always wanted to be a bit hands-on. And of course, I'm sure like yourself and me and a lot of us, we have in the back of our minds pictures of the capabilities of all of our customers, and it's a broad range. I mean, I've never had a single mode. I've based a lot on, what the customer wanted, what they were willing to do, and that's how I would tailor my, the service of what I do for them. But what I find myself doing is really being upfront with them about my own feelings and what I'm willing to do and what I'm going to ask them to do. And I'll be honest with you, I mean, and for the first time, that has included asking them to either bring equipment to me that needed work, or I would go down there and I would say, be prepared for you to bring a piece of equipment out of your place or put it on a table outside, and I'll look at it there. I mean, it's a tough time, and just as we're making adjustments, I think it's reasonable to expect and ask our customers if they're willing to make some adjustments in the process of, how I'm dealing with them. And, these are customers that I've had for many years, and we know each other well. And at some point, I mean, I guess it might even come down to a decision of that it's happened to me of saying, I'm not comfortable doing that. And, it might reach a point of saying, that perhaps they'd be better off with somebody who's willing to do more than I might be at this point in time. And that's a bridge, I guess, I'll cross, or we all have to cross at some point. But fortunately for me, I haven't had any major outages in any environments that, that would have tested my resolve. Let's put it that way.
Well, I want to just say, as a fellow practitioner, I really affirm your position. And I want to say that it's one of these very interesting situations where it's not just you that you're protecting. So this dynamic isn't, well, I'm not willing to do that because I'm not willing to put myself at risk. It's much more, I don't want to put anyone at risk. And since we don't know about the vectors involved, we want to do everything we can to reduce the risk. And I found people have a good understanding. I did want to share for what it's worth, my own understanding of the advances in epidemiology about this. And the short version, as I understand it, is that epidemiologists seem to be less concerned now about surfaces and much more concerned about droplet transmission. So my impression from hearing from people is that the primary mode of transmission of this virus is from your mouth and nose and breathing stuff out in the air and someone else getting these particles into their body. And so this is why the emphasis on masks is so intense, because if you're wearing a mask, it's much, much harder for you to be near somebody and breathe this stuff out in enough volume for it to do the damage that it wants to do. And from a surface standpoint, I, for one, I've been quarantining stuff a little less intensely than I did at the beginning, because I've been told that it's less of an issue. And I think one of the things I find, like I had a friend who's washing all his groceries and stuff, and I found myself saying, if I put a lot of energy into doing that, the amount of energy I'll have to wear my mask, to be very conscientious about that, to be firm with my customers, I just know my limitations. And so my own bias about this is to put the money on the masks and on social distance, on not being close to people. But the other thing is, we talked about this at our clinic meeting, which we have Zoom meetings once a week for our clinic, which for those of you familiar with it, we used to meet every week in the basement of the old Cambridge Baptist Church in Harvard Square. And one of the questions was, when do we go back to the clinic? When do we open up again? And my answer was, not for a very long time. And the reason why is because the clinic is in the basement with relatively poor ventilation, very small corridors, one bathroom, and the place where we work, if we have any number of volunteers, everyone's right next on top of each other. And there just didn't seem to be any way of doing this clinic safely there. And so I think in asking the questions for your customers, Jeff, I think someone who's pressuring us to do something that in any appreciable way increases the risk of transmission in either direction has to have their heads examined. And I'll give you an example. I have a very unusual customer experience this month. I may have shared this with some of you. A customer asked me, a long-term customer, a home residential customer, asked me if I could do their Zoom wedding for them. So these people created this extremely wonderful, creative Zoom wedding, which involved 10 videos. It involved a video cam to watch them as they walked into their house and sat in front of this altar, where the officiant, who was in a different location, zoomed in and did the marriage with them. It was quite complicated, and they called me a week before the wedding and said, we realized we need, we were going to have a relative do this. We need to hire someone to do this. Are you willing to do it? And I was very honored that they would want me to do their wedding. But I said, I don't make house calls. I can't come to your house where your computers are set up and run the wedding from there. I would have to do it remotely. So they were grumpy about it. They said, well, you sure you can't come? I said, yes, I will not come to your house. I won't do it. It's a policy. But I do a lot of things remotely. So I can control your computers remotely from my office. And I'm very willing to do that to internet connections. There's a bunch of stuff we can do to reduce the risk of things, you know, crashing in the middle or something. So we went ahead and started this process, and it was actually really, from a just a logistical standpoint, quite challenging. They had this really fancy setup. This guy had 2 monitors set up with his computer, and one was the gave access to the different Zoom. He had a Zoom account. He bought a special webinar Zoom account that allowed to have these things called web moderators, and then there were participants, and the moderators each had their own camera. So there's this complicated interweaving of cameras, videos, people, turning things off, turning things on. And it was challenging for me to figure out when to push, when to do this. And I worked really hard at it. I have a theater background. I'm used to doing backstage stuff. So I was really into this, and I worked really hard to get good at it. We kept having problems. There were timing issues, but then we started having weird technical problems. Like 2 days before the wedding, his machine started freezing. And he was sure it was the remote access that was causing this. I've been using remote access, as many of you have, for many, many years. I've never known a remote access program to freeze a computer. But anyway, this is the customer, right? So also, I kept making mistakes. It was difficult to visualize what was going on in these computers sometimes and get things just right. So 2 days before, the groom calls me, and he says, we want to ask you if you're willing to come over and do this wedding at our house. So here I was, Jeff, on the spot with that exactly what you're talking about. And it was a very complicated moment because I really wanted these people, I'd come to really like these people a lot and really cared about what they were trying to do, which is get 70 people from all over the world to share this really important moment with them. I've been married. I take marriages very, very seriously. I know how couples feel when they're getting married. And so I took that into account. I took into account that I was genuinely concerned, whatever was going on with the remote access. I don't know if it was freezing the computer, but one of the remote access programs had problems. I wanted to do the other. In any event, I was really worried. And so I thought, you know what? They have this office. They're going to air it out the day before. They're going to wipe it down. I'm going to go in there for 2 hours. I'm not going to see them. I'm going to go in and leave. And I really feel like I want to do this for this couple. So I did. The wedding went beautifully. I was proud to be involved. It was just delightful. And felt I made the right decision. And then they wanted me to give a big discount on the bill. And I was furious. Their argument for the discount was that all this remote stuff took much longer than it needed to have, and they shouldn't have to pay me for that. And I was furious because my response was, first of all, I told you in the first place I had no intention of coming to your house. And if we had technical problems, that was part of the fun. Like that when you do a Zoom wedding, you're going to have technical problems. I shouldn't even cause them. And their argument was, you are an expert, and you told us it would be okay to do it remotely. And my position was, I didn't tell you it was okay. I never tell people that about computers. I said, I'm willing to work hard to help you have a good wedding, and I've done a lot of remote stuff, and I've had very good luck with it. So we argued about this, and they were very, very grumpy. I ended up insisting that they pay the full amount, and they did. But they felt that they had gotten a raw deal. So there's the story.
The easy answer is the old fall back to the adage of no good deed goes unpunished. And I'll let that go with that. But the one thing I wanted to comment on was when you said you've never seen a remote program, cause havoc. And I will tell you an instance that I finally tracked down where, for years I was using and deploying VNC. It's VNC, right? That remote,
VNC, yeah.
Right. And which means I still have a few customers using it, and had one customer hit me with a very odd occurrence where who's an extremely hard Excel user and was having a lot of trouble cutting and pasting. And I'm trying to recall exactly what it looked like, but clearly it wasn't working, and very much looking like, there was something wrong with Excel in its ability to, because you couldn't do the simplest of cut and paste operations successfully. And to make a long story short, turns out there is an incompatibility with VNC because VNC, the way it operates, hoards the cut and paste buffer.
Oh,
And so when you're using Office and you're trying to do any kind of if you're home using VNC to remote into your Office computer, forget about it, and you're running Excel or Word and you're trying to do a cut and paste operation, forget about it.
that is so interesting.
And
Thank
it
you.
was weird, and it was only through the good graces of Google that I stumbled into it, because
Sorry,
I was.
Jeff, could you say that phrase again? It does what with the clipboard?
My understanding is it takes over the clipboard to do some of its own internal operations.
Amazing. Amazing. And they
Is
didn't
my
think-
understanding, and you can Google that and get to the details of it, because this was a couple of months ago, and I'm sorry, I apologize. I have forgotten the exact details, but basically VNC hoards the cut and paste buffer to the point that it competes with other applications that are trying to use it. So if you're remoting in and using like Excel and Word and cutting and pasting like you normally would, it'll copy, it'll cut, but when you go to paste, it will only paste a text version of your cell. And I'm talking Excel, not Word. I mean, he was using Excel heavily. So if you were cutting a formula, if you were cutting and pasting a formula, cutting or pasting a number, it wouldn't work. It would just dump a text image of whatever you saw in that cell in the target. And after, and he's pushing to me, well, something's wrong with Microsoft Office. Let's uninstall it. I'm sure all you guys know as professionals, at least I know as a professional, the first, second, sometimes third most obvious thing of the problem, I'm usually wrong about. So the one thing I've learned more than anything is to step back, take a deep breath, and let's take a good look at this before you're uninstalling or trying to patch or fix or whatever.
Yeah.
And I was so uncomfortable with the circumstances that instead of, going at it with the sledgehammer, I decided to really try to do some research. And that's where I found a very obscure reference in Google that, with VNC corrupting and, taking over and then corrupting paste buffers.
That's a beautiful story. And I can just imagine that BNC engineers saying, no one will ever notice. We need this. No one will ever notice.
I can't explain it, but I mean, it was one of those instances where, like I said, under a normal circumstance, I'd have been uninstalling Office. God knows what I've been doing.
Sure.
But it felt I was just uncomfortable with the problem enough of not knowing what was causing this enough that I decided I really want to stop and take a much harder look at this.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
And that's really, I mean, when you have years of experience, I think, when people ask me, what's the best lesson that you get out of it? And that is to pause and really understand the problem and just not rush off and do the first, second, or third thing that you think it's going to be.
Yeah, well, I've had a few artifacts of remote connection that, in their worst cases, interfere with the work. What was I watching? The Skype or something I was working with a client on. I finally figured out that the camera was delivering the video to his monitor, probably going raw, so to speak, to the video RAM, and logging in just showed a black rectangle. Or didn't even show it at all. And I had no idea he was seeing a camera image. It was something along those lines. And I finally realized there must be some raw, data transmission going on inside the machine that LogMeIn just isn't picking up. So yeah, it's awkward when you don't realize that the remote connection itself isn't, the same as being there. But it's, how do you tell?
There are
Well,
these,
I'll tell you one way you can tell, and that is to try to remote in with a different product. When I remoted in with TeamViewer, the problem went away, and that's how I tested. I used one remote product to install a second remote product, and then I logged in and tested it that way.